Good afternoon, everyone. I hope you can all hear me. You're all very welcome to this webinar session today. My name is Keelan Ward. I'm a Pensions Policy Manager at the Institute and Faculty of Actuaries. The meeting today is on the performance of a CDC pension scheme against alternative pension schemes. Very interesting topic, as I'm sure you're all aware, since the developments since the Pension Schemes Act. And as a testament to that, we have 281 delegates that have signed on as of just before this meeting, which is fantastic. A big welcome to all of you. I'm not going to talk for very long, only to highlight that all questions will be at the end of the session. But don't worry, we will get to any questions that maybe don't get answered because of time. Please use the chat box for questions and drop them in at any point. Members of the team are on hand. You will see also that we will be popping up polls during the chat as well, and you're also very welcome to get involved in those. Just makes for a better session, and we want to genuinely hear from you. I think I'll introduce our speaker now and then hand over. So our speaker today is Professor Catherine Donnelly. Catherine's a professor in the Department of Actuarial Mathematics and Statistics at Heriot-Watt University, and also the director of the Risk Insight Lab. She's a qualified actuary who previously worked in the pensions industry. Catherine has a PhD from the University of Waterloo, Canada, and an MSc from the University of Oxford, as well as an MA from the University of Cambridge. Her research interests lie in pensions and life insurance, and she's published widely in these areas. Catherine's also a member of the USS Joint Expert Panel and has a keen interest in developing workable solutions to improve people's financial situation in retirement. So I think that's enough for me. Over to you, Catherine.
Thanks very much, Kieran. Well, it's a pleasure to be able to present some of our recent research results about CDC pension schemes. So this is part of the research programme Minimising Longevity and Investment Risk while Optimising Future Pension Plans. And basically there are two themes within this programme. So one of them is looking at what I'll say is a defined benefit DB-like CDC pension scheme. And I'm going to show you some of the research results today. And we had a recent webinar on some aspects of that before, and I'll highlight some of those results that are relevant to what I'm going to present today as well. The other theme on this research programme is on pooled annuity funds. Now, they could be considered a type of post-retirement only CDC pension scheme as well, but the focus of that theme of research is on sharing longevity risk only, whereas on this particular CDC, DB like CDC topic I'm going to present today, we're sharing both longevity and investment risk. So I will start by giving you a high level look at what we're going to find out today in today's presentation, but we will, I'll go through some motivation and so on before we get to the actual results. And I'll have to introduce some of the previous results we did on intergenerational risk sharing to explain the results as well. Otherwise, you'd be wondering where some of the results came from. Okay, but what we find today with the new results I'm going to present today are that if we look at this defined benefit like CDC scheme, so one that looks in appearance very much like a DB scheme, and it's a stylization of the Royal Mail scheme. Then if we look at the income paid at retirement to each generation in the scheme, then we see as the later a generation enters the scheme, then the standard deviation of their income increases. And we'll explain why that happens later on as well. We also see that the median income decreases with the generation. And this is an unusual feature, and it's due to the constant benefit accrual rate in this particular DB scheme that we study. Usually what you see in CDC schemes studied, certainly in the academic literature, is that the median income increases over time with the standard deviation of the income. But the usual CDC scheme in the literature doesn't have a constant benefit accrual. It has this, what's called it would be in this case an age-related benefit accrual, or one that's actuarially fair, in the sense that your contribution should equal the expected discounted value of your benefits accrued by that contribution. But we'll discuss why we see this sort of anomaly later on. The other thing we'll see is that the CDC scheme, this particular DB-like CDC scheme that we've modelled, needs to take more investment risk to outperform the alternative pension schemes that we compare it to on a median income basis. Right? And these alternative pension schemes are basically you invest in a DC scheme pre-retirement, and then you either buy a life annuity or you go into a pooled annuity fund. So I'll just briefly explain what that is again later on, or you go into income drawdown. But what we see is that because of this higher investment risk, to outperform these alternatives on the median income basis, has to take more investment risk, which means that we end up with a higher standard deviation of income in the CDC. So there's basically no free lunch with respect to risk in a CDC scheme, or I guess any scheme. So that's the high level results that we'll look at. So we'll look at some numerical results at the end of the presentation. But before that, I thought it was probably a good idea to motivate or to think about what solution, to what problem is the CDC scheme a potential solution. So if we just step back from all of this for a few minutes and we'll look at the current situation. So I'm going to present some data from the Office for National Statistics, the ONS, and just to get a sort of picture of what's going on in the UK. So in the UK, we have had the great success of automatic enrolment, which is basically the government saying we want all employees to be enrolled into a pension of some sort, a workplace pension. And this started in around 2012 for the largest employers, and it was rolled out progressively to the smaller employers. And we've arrived at the situation where we have somewhere around 80% of employees are in a workplace pension. And the chart you can see in front of you, it's showing you the calendar year on the x-axis and the proportion of employees with a workplace pension in the UK. So the sort of topmost green line is the important one in terms of enrolment into the workplace pension. And you can see it's gone from about just under 50% of employees in a workplace pension around 2012 to about 80% today. So a great success, and there was a lot of people saying maybe it won't be a success at the time, but it's worked out well. You can also see, because the lower lines show you the split between different types of pension scheme, you can see that the people being enrolled into these pension schemes are being enrolled into DC pension plans, right? So defined benefit DB pension plan enrollment has gone down. That's not a surprise to, I would say, most of this audience, and the DC enrollment has gone up, DC plus group personal stakeholder and SIP. So we'll just again look at some more data. Okay, so now we have the proportion of employees with workplace pension split by public sector or private sector. So if you look at the public sector 2021 figures, so we've seen the public sector, so these two green arrows are showing the lines of interest here. This coloured type of bar chart is showing you that the public sector workers are mostly invested in an occupational DB pension scheme. So over 80% of them, sort of darker blue line, colouring a bar in this public sector 2021 line, they're DB. And there's a fair number of them have no pension, and otherwise they're in some sort of DC arrangement. In the private sector, it's really quite different. So we see in the private sector, there's hardly anybody in a defined benefit pension plan, right? So comparison to over 80% in the public sector, we see less than 10% in the private sector. And then in the private sector, now these are employees, not including the self-employed, we have of the remaining sort of 93 or 4%, about a third of them have no pension, and then the remainder in some sort of defined contribution like savings. Right, so it's a split between private and public sector. And then we look at the value of pension pots not yet in payment. So the ONS has got lots of this kind of really nice data to give us a picture. So we see here on this table, we see the percentile of people of all ages who have a certain amount in their DC pension savings and DB pension savings, right? So the 25 percentile for all ages of people who have pension pots not yet in payment, so basically people before age 65. In a DC pension savings, they have about £2,500, and in DB, they have 21,800. Now, if you look at the actual data, you see it gives you the pension savings for DC and DB by age range, and you see more or less at the highest amount of pension savings is the 10 years prior to retirement. So we looked, for example, at age 55 to 64, then at the sort of lowest 25 percentile, lowest quarter, and they only have about 7,500 in pension savings. So being interrupted here by a small child. And DB pension savings, it's significantly more, 68,400. So we can look here, just give you some time to look at this. So the DC pension savings, we generally see people have much smaller amount of money in their DC pension pot compared to the DB pension pot, right? So the median, the 50 percentile, 10 years prior to retirement age is 55 to 64. People have around £35,000 in DC and about 5 times that in a DB pension savings. Okay, so basically they've got much less in DC compared to DB pension savings. So in terms of the picture of people, we're looking at people who are, we're interested in people who are saving in DC pension pot, but they don't have a lot of money in that pension pot and they're private sector workers. So what do people want in retirement? That's another question that's very important in this. So I'll just show one survey, but you can find other surveys and they tend to show the same thing, basically. So this is an Aon DC member survey from 2014 done with Aon Hewitt and Cass Business School. And they asked people basically, how might you spend your pension fund? And 68% of people say, I want my pension fund to provide a stable income over my lifetime. And this kind of figure isn't very surprising when you see similar surveys. So just show one here. You see a similar type of picture. So many people want a stable income over their lifetime. And we have another one. This was a more, this was an internet survey, this Great British Retirement Survey. They show quite interesting questions. And they ask people, what are your biggest financial concerns for the non-retired? So this was in 2019, this was published. So just over a quarter of them said running out of money, and another just under a quarter said the rising cost of living. But basically this concern about having an income for life, not running out of money, and being able to basically pay for your lifestyle, these are all concerns of people. So our summary of what am I taking from the data is our typical DC pension saver works in the private sector and doesn't have very much in their DC pension savings. But they want an income for life, right? So the questions are how to offer them an income for life, how to also increase their contributions, right? So we know that the current workplace pension contribution rate is only 8% of salaries. And how can we give them value for money? So if they don't have a large amount of pension savings, we need their money to work hard for them to be efficient in terms of what we're giving them. Now, at the moment, the whole system, the DC pension system, isn't well structured to offer these things. So it isn't structured to offer people an income for life. It isn't structured to help people to increase contributions, because I'm sure many of you will receive an annual DC pension statement. And the huge focus in those pension statements are on what was your return on your various fund investments in your DC pension plan. And buried away somewhere will be, this is your estimated income at retirement, but that's not the main focus. And it really should be. There should be a stronger link between what you contribute and what you're going to get as an income in retirement. Excuse me. So basically, this is the reason to look at arrangements where you're sharing longevity risk, and potentially also, as we do here, we're looking at this, sharing also investment risk, to give people an income for life and to give them value for money as much as possible, and to try to get them to pay enough so that they have the income they would like in retirement. So CDC schemes aim to do this, so through sharing investment risk and or longevity risk. So as I mentioned before at the start of the webinar, we're also looking at another stream of research in this programme, looking at pooled annuity funds where we share only longevity risk between people. CDC schemes, there are many types of CDC schemes. They can be whole life. That's the one we're going to look at here, where you contribute to these schemes while you're working and then you retire, stay within the scheme when you retire and get a pension from it. Or it could be decumulation or post-retirement only. And there definitely seems to be a shift from the consultancies here in the CDC pension space to talk about decumulation or post-retirement only CDC pension plans. They seem to be talking about, from what I can garner, that they're talking about sharing both longevity risk and investment risk in retirement. But basically, such schemes would probably fit well with somebody who was happy to save DC pre-retirement, but then wasn't sure what to do post-retirement. That could be a possible option to add to the existing options of life annuity and income drawdown. But we are focusing here on a whole life scheme. So you're in this scheme, you contribute to the scheme every year while you're working, and you get a pension every year until you die in retirement. Now, just a quick reminder here about the types of schemes that we see. So we have defined contribution, defined benefit, DC and DB, well established in the UK. And now we have this new scheme, the CDC scheme, with the Royal Mail to be the first one. So the CDC and the DC look very similar in many ways. So they have the same, they have a fixed contribution level, so that doesn't vary, but their benefit levels vary. But this is basically where the DC and the CDC scheme vary, is in the calculation, where they differ is in the calculation of their benefit levels. But in both DC and CDC, the members bear the risk. And who decides the level of risk? Well, that's an important question. In the DC, it's usually the member chooses the default fund. And so whoever chooses the default fund is deciding the level of risk taken by the members. In the CDC fund, it seems the trustees. How much of a say the members will have, I guess that remains to be seen. And then the DB pension plan, we have sort of the opposite levers. So in the DB pension plan, the contribution levels vary. So typically the employer will take the variation in the contribution level cost, and the benefit levels are fixed. So we have two levers, and those are varied. You could have a scheme in between all these things where you vary both the contribution levels and the benefit levels, but we're not looking at that yet. Okay, so we're going on to the operation of this particular CDC scheme we're looking at. But at high level, all CDC plans, indeed pension plans, look the same. So members make contributions, which builds the fund value. The fund is invested, however, in line with the investment strategy of the fund, earning investment returns, that accumulates, and then benefit payments are paid out. What we'll see in the CDC scheme is that this benefit payment is really very complicated and has a lot of implications for who's bearing what risk within the scheme. Okay, so this is the defined benefit like CDC scheme structure we're going to look at. So it's a whole life scheme. Members join the scheme at age 25. They contribute every year for 40 years. They contribute a fixed percentage of their salary, and they retire at age 65. We assume in the model that nobody dies before age 65. But then once they're past age 65, they die in line with a particular life table. As they pay contributions, they accrue benefits at a constant rate of their salary, so 1/80th of their salary per year. And they just get paid a single life pension in retirement from age 65. Now, so that looks, on the surface, it looks like a defined benefit scheme. That's why I say it's DB-like. But every year, the benefits accrued will be adjusted so that the total asset value across the scheme equals the total discounted value of the projected accrued benefits. So we'll just look at a little example involving that just to see what that means, because it's a lot of words involved in it. So the benefit adjustment is done through the declaration of an annual constant pension increase. And this is where we're just doing a stylisation of a Royal Mail type scheme, because in the Royal Mail scheme, you look at the future predicted inflation curve and you add on a constant pension increase to that future curve. Whereas we're just assuming here a constant pension increase. We're not looking at any future inflation curve. But basically, there's an annual pension increase is calculated every year, and every member in the scheme who had accrued benefits from last year, they will get the same annual increase on their accrued benefits. And this is the source of the risk sharing in the CDC plan. And it's, well, we discussed this in a previous webinar, some of the implications of the risk sharing. And we'll highlight some of the results that are relevant for this presentation shortly. So we'll just look at sort of what's going on there. Okay, so how do we do this calculation? So we want to every year in our scheme determine the annual pension increase. So we take one member, right? So just presume that we do some valuations today, and that member is age 31, and they a year ago were age 30, and they had, we just make up some number and say they had accrued £500 per annum as a pension. So we project that accrued pension, £500 per annum, to their retirement date and beyond, allowing for the probabilities of survival to each age past age 65. We assume they survive to age 65, but then they can die after that. And we project it using an unknown pension increase H, because we want to find H. Then we discount those projected payments back to today, and we're just going to use a constant discount rate that's derived from a stochastic model. So we're just trying to do an approach that's basically a typical pension scheme valuation. So we do that for every member in the scheme who's been in the scheme for at least 1 year, so that they have accrued a pension from a year ago. And we sum up the discounted value for all those members to get the total discounted value of their projected accrued benefits. We equate that to the asset value, and then effectively the total discounted value of projected accrued benefits is some function of H, this unknown pension increase H, and we solve for H, right? So we've got an implicit equation to solve, but we solve for H, the annual pension increase. So if we, for example, find that H was 3%, then we would tell all the members your revised accrued pension this year, today, is 3% higher than last year. So for this particular member, we would tell them that their new accrued pension is £515 per annum, a 3% increase on their £500 per annum. Okay, so that's the collective pension increases. Now, these pension increases are highly, highly complex, right? Because basically they include so many things in them based on predictions of the future and the past. So because of this collective nature of how they're calculated, they will depend on today's predictions of future returns and mortality, because we had to project those pensions and then discount them back using projected returns and mortality. They also depend on the composition of the membership today. So who was in the scheme, how much money did they have, what age they were. They will also depend on previous year's predictions of those same things and the previous year's membership profile, because the accrued pension that, for example, for this particular member we looked at, that £500 will be, is the accumulation based on, of the accrued pension based on past pension increases. And each of those pension increases were based on predictions of returns at the time they were declared. And it will also depend, the asset value will also depend on past predictions, because the asset value will accumulate with actual returns. But once you start paying out benefits, then those benefits depend on all these past year's predictions and so on of returns and mortality. So therefore the asset value will depend on it as well. And we also have the dependence on clearly past investment returns. So there's a lot of things going on in these schemes in terms of dependence on the past, right? And this is where all this intergenerational risk sharing starts going on because of this. It's all wrapped up into these pension increases. Now, from our previous results that we've done to date in this program done at Heriot-Watt, we have we looked at basically a kind of decomposition or understanding of the intergenerational risk sharing in this type of scheme. Now, what we see is that in this type of scheme, there's a higher pension paid to the first generations, and we'll see that in the numerical results later. And the reason is that if we think of the first generation to join this scheme, when they join, they pay a contribution as a fixed percentage of their salary, and they get 1/80th of their salary as an accrued benefit. But basically, the contribution they pay is too high. It's, well, not too high, it's much greater than the value of their discounted value of their accrued benefit, right? And so whenever we do this at the end of the first year, so after the first generation's been in the scheme for 1 year, at the end of the first year, we do this calculation of the pension increase. So the contribution they made when they joined the scheme will have accumulated with investment returns. But to equate that their accumulated contributions, the total asset value, equal to the total discounted value of projected accrued pensions, we have to increase the accrued benefits by quite a lot to match the asset value most of the time, unless asset returns have been particularly poor. But generally, we have to increase the accrued benefit, the pension increase applied to that accrued benefit by quite a lot, sort of relatively to what we thought we were going to have to do, quite a lot to match the total asset value. And that's because whenever we do a constant rate of benefit accrual, that calculation, the constant rate of benefit accrual, is done on a lifetime basis. So it's basically done by equating your discounted lifetime contributions to the scheme with your discounted benefits accrued in the scheme. But the calculation of the pension increases does things on an accrued basis rather than a lifetime basis. And this is where we have this imbalance. So what you see is the first generations have a higher pension, and therefore the later generations end up paying for this. This basically gets passed forward to the later generations, and they do worse because of this. But this could be mitigated by an age-related benefit accrual, so that we have basically actuarial fairness. The contribution should equal the expected discounted value of the benefit accrued by that particular contribution. The other thing that happens is that in this scheme, because of this intergenerational risk sharing, whenever someone joins the scheme, they are bearing the cost of what happened to previous generations. It may be in their favour, it may not be in their favour. But this means that effectively they start off, each generation into the scheme starts off on a increasingly wider range of possible starting values for them, according to what happened in the past. And this means that we end up with a greater range of outcomes in the scheme according to what's happened in the past. And the further you go along, the greater the possible range of values. And of course, this is all done standing from the perspective of time zero, the start of the scheme. That's where we're standing, and we're looking well into the future. Okay, so this is now we're looking at how does the CDC pension scheme, sort of the point of this presentation, how does the CDC scheme compare to alternatives? And the goal in this is to pay an inflation-linked income for life. So before I do that, I'll just explain briefly, if you haven't heard of a pooled annuity fund before, some of you may have seen heard my earlier talks on this, or heard of it from somewhere else, but I'll just tell you briefly in case you haven't heard of it. So a pooled annuity fund looks very much like a life annuity, except it doesn't have investment and mortality or longevity guarantees. It's just a structure to pool longevity risk. And basically what happens is that the deaths in the fund subsidise the survivors, exactly as what happens in a life annuity at the heart of it. So basically in these schemes, when somebody dies, their fund is shared out among the survivors. And this gives us what we call a longevity credit to the survivors and enables them to have a higher income for longer. So in these schemes, they are trying to give people let's say they can take more risk than in a life annuity, because a life annuity is fully guaranteed, but it's not as risky as income drawdown. And you can eliminate a lot of your longevity risk. So if we just look at just this chart here, so we have here the sort of current accumulation options for retirement for someone who's in a DC pension plan. So we have here increasing investment risk on the x-axis, increasing longevity risk on the y-axis. And we look here, income drawdown, this box in the top. So you can choose how much investment risk you take in income drawdown, going from very low risk, like cash or bonds, to as well as risky as you can imagine. But you bear all of your longevity risk. And the life annuity sits down in the bottom left. The conventional life annuity would sit down really the extreme bottom left corner here, where the consumer bears no investment risk and no longevity risk. And then you can get variants on life annuities like investment-linked annuities and so on. But basically, the pooled annuity fund is a type of longevity risk sharing structure, and the aim is to span this gap with them, right? So to allow people to pool longevity risk, and you could also do other things like pool investment risk if you want it. You could add in guarantees if you want, as much residual as you like. And if you added enough guarantees, you can end up with a life annuity again. But basically, it's just to pool longevity risk with people to lower and ideally eliminate to as low as you can their idiosyncratic longevity risk. So they don't have to guess how long they're going to live for in retirement. Right, so that's just a brief, very, very brief talk about pooled annuity funds, and I have previous webinars on those. Now, to the alternative pension schemes, right, so we're going to look at 4 pension schemes in total. So the first one is this DB-like CDC scheme, where you accrue benefits at a 1/80th rate, but you have these pension increases that every member gets the same pension increase at each point in time. So the pension increases change over time in accordance with actual investment returns and what we predict about the future, about future returns and future mortality. And they also change according to the scheme membership profile, though we haven't studied that here, but that also has an impact, how that changes over time. So we compare it to 3 effectively DC type options, right? So pre-retirement, these 3 other options, you're invested in a DC pension scheme and you're contributing the same percentage of salary as you do in the CDC scheme. But then in retirement, you make one of 3 possible choices. So in the life annuity, you buy your life annuity at age 65, and then you're locked into a particular income for the rest of your life, but guaranteed. Pooled annuity fund, you join the pooled annuity fund at age 65. We can take more risk in the pooled annuity fund, if you like, in terms of investment. The members are exposed to longevity risk, so they're exposed to systematic longevity risk in particular, but we're not going to study that here because that sort of another layer of analysis and complicates the CDC scheme simulations. It would just be horrendous, to be honest, but that should be something that should be studied. The systematic longevity risk in a CDC scheme. I have done a study of systematic longevity risk in a pooled annuity fund already. We have a webinar on that. But basically, you join this pooled annuity fund and you share in the longevity experience, and you also continue to invest your money and get investment returns. And the final option is income drawdown. So we assume that an income drawdown, you're targeting an income until age 90, because under the life table we just used a sort of fixed life table, S1 PMA table. You have a 5% survival chance to age 90, right? So that's basically a 25-year fixed term annuity you're targeting in the income drawdown starting at age 65. Okay, so the first tell you about the model, right? So we run this under the Wilkie model. It's a mean reverting model, which I'm sure nearly everybody will have heard of if you're in the UK. It's a model fitted to 1923 to 2009 data. So the parameterization is taken from the paper by David Wilkie and others in 2010. I think it's the Annals it's published. But I started at the long-term mean value. So this is really quite a neutral starting position. It's not up here and trying to go down to its long-term mean or down there. It's at its long-term mean. So we're basically seeing fluctuations around the mean values, just sort of the normal fluctuations from the model. Everyone survives to age 65 in this model, because in this fund, because we have no death and service benefits, so it just seemed better to allow them to survive. And then they follow this particular life table. We are focused particularly on investment risk in this study. So we just assume there are many people in the scheme, so we don't have idiosyncratic longevity risk except for the very last generations when they're older, and we ignore systematic longevity risk. So those are all the assumptions. Obviously, we've made some simplifying assumptions within this. Now, this is just the first chart I'm going to show you. So what we have here is I'm assuming that all the options you're investing 100% in equities, and it's not realistic. I'll show you another chart, the next one, which is people following more realistic strategies under these options. It's just to sort of give us a baseline comparison. Okay, so we see this chart here. So on the x-axis, we have the generation number from 0 to 150. So we've run the scheme for a very long time, right? So we've got 150 generations in it. And the y-axis, this is showing effectively the replacement ratio at the time of retirement for each generation, right? So that time of retirement is going to be increasing over time with each generation, because they're joining one year after the other, right? So if a group of 25-year-olds join at time 0, they will then retire 40 years later. Time 1 will have another group of 25-year-olds join. They will themselves retire 40 years after they join. So that would then be at time 41 and so on. So this is showing you their replacement ratio, or in other words, their pension as a percentage of their salary at retirement. So if your replacement ratio was 50% and your salary in the year before retirement was £30,000, that would mean that you were at retirement getting £15,000. Now, under all of these options except the life annuity one, your income past age 65, the first age at retirement, will vary. But we're just looking here just at the retirement one. Now, on this chart, the black line is the CDC median replacement ratio, right? And so we see that the median replacement ratio is highest for the first generations, and then it falls, right? This is to do with the constant rate of benefit accrual. Then it falls over time, and the last generations get an even lower one, and they're basically bearing the crystallization of this higher benefit payments to the first generations. The green line is the DC plus pooled annuity fund. Now, it will, in this case, do better than the life annuity. We basically don't have a fair comparison here with the life annuity, but basically the life annuity here, I've added on a 5% loading. It's basically to have a loading greater than 0 to just acknowledge in some way that the life annuity has guarantees, and therefore it will, in this case, a median or an expected income basis, give you a worse outcome compared to the pooled annuity fund, because they're both pulling longevity risk, and we've got lots and lots of people in this. It doesn't show you here the risk faced by the people in the pooled annuity fund if they're facing systematic longevity risk. We haven't included that, but that's another webinar. But basically, they're the same sort of ballpark, the pooled annuity fund and life annuity. And then income drawdown, is the red line, the bottom line, you do worse. That is basically because you don't benefit from longevity risk pooling, right? So you really benefit a lot from longevity risk pooling. But we see here the CDC scheme, you do better if you're the first generations, and then it falls below the DC plus pooled annuity fund or life annuity. Okay, so let's now turn to more realistic investment strategies. I'm not saying these are entirely realistic, but just more realistic. So let's just keep the CDC scheme investing 100% equities. Now in practice, you might be more like 80% equities, but we'll just say 100% equities pre-retirement and post-retirement. For all the DC options, I assume you invest 100% equities, the same as in the CDC scheme, but only up to age 55 for each person. And then they'll step down to a different investment strategy by age 65. So in the life annuity, you're going to step down from 100% equities to 100% bonds between ages 55 and 65. And then you buy your, you buy your life annuity, but I'm assuming the life annuity that you buy at the time of retirement will be based on a 100% bond investment to calculate that annuity value. Then the pooled annuity fund and the income drawdown follow the same strategy. So they do 100% equities to age 55 and then step down to 30% equities, 70% bonds at age 65. And they maintain that strategy in retirement. Again, we could do, lots of variations around that, but this is just a sort of rough look at different investment risk borne by different pension options. So if we look at the same chart, but with these revised investment strategies, then the black line doesn't change, right? So that was our CDC line. It's the same as it was before because you're following the same investment strategy. So we have generation number on the x-axis and y-axis is the replacement ratio, and the other lines fall down, right? So we see that the pooled annuity fund still does the best of the other DC options. It's doing the best because it was basically taking more risk. And in our model, we assume that sort of underlying assumption is that equities will outperform in the long term on average, right? So, and because here we're looking at a median, we're not looking at extremes of the distribution. It all looks wonderful in the median, right? So the DC plus pooled annuity fund does better. And the life annuity, because it is targeting bonds, 100% bonds rather than the pooled annuity funds, 30% equity, 70% bonds. The life annuity is less risky and therefore gets us lower return. That's why they see this increased gap between the green and the blue lines, so the top and the middle of the more or less horizontal lines. And then income drawdown, again, falls below the pooled annuity fund, even though they're following the same strategy, because you're not getting the longevity risk sharing in retirement. But we see here that with the CDC taking on more investment risk, it's able to outperform, for most of the generations, these other options, right? So on a median income basis. Okay, so that's the median income. So if we then turn to think about, let's do some sort of measurement of the risk. So it's really messy looking at the quantiles, different lines, because we've got 4 different things. So we just look at the standard deviation of this replacement ratio. Okay, so we have a similar sort of setup as before. So the generation number on the x-axis, and on the y-axis, we have the standard deviation of the replacement ratio at retirement. So the previous chart was showing the median of the replacement ratio at retirement, and now look at the standard deviation. So what we see is that the black line is showing us the CDC line, and it's going up over time, right? So what's going on there? Why is it going up over time? Okay, so basically what's happening is that for the first generations who enter the scheme, right, so around time 0, or generation 0, I should say, you can see that the standard deviation of income is below the DC options, right? So when the first generations join, let's say the very first generation joins, they start from effectively a sort of 0 risk position. They're not inheriting any past costs from anybody, exactly as you would in a DC pension fund. But the first generation to come in, their contributions are in investment returns. But because of the calculation of the pension increase, they're not exposed to the full impact of investment returns. So if investment returns are above expectations, then their pension increases will imply, won't basically reflect that full investment return over expectations. It will just soften the impact of it. And this means that the first generations end up with a lower range of possible income values they can have because of the softening impact of the predictions of what's going to happen in the future compared to what we actually experience. This is the nature of this investment risk sharing. But because they have not been exposed to the full impact of investment returns, there's a cost floating around somewhere, and that cost is effectively passed on to the next generation to join. Not entirely, because some of it's still borne by the first generations, but some of it will be passed on to the next generation. Then the next generation are no longer starting at a 0 risk position as the first generation was. They've now got a range of possible values according to how the experience of the first generation was. And then they will have their own experience starting from one of these values. If we were able to move forward in time to see what that value was, they would then have their own range of possible values. Then again, the generation after them bears their cost of their experience, and we end up with an even bigger range because we sort of have ranges upon ranges upon ranges. And this means that you end up with this increasing standard deviation of the income over time as the risk is building up in the CDC scheme. Whereas when you look at the other options, the pooled annuity fund and so on, we don't see this risk building up in the same way over time. It's more or less constant over the generations. Again, this was due to this particular choice of this neutral model, right? But the CDC fund, the risk does build up over time because of this intergenerational cross subsidies. And this is not unusual for any of these investment risk sharing structures. If you look at them, other types of them, you see a similar type of effect. Okay, so then, and then it's a little bit difficult to see. So if I just turn back a couple of slides here. So we had the median of the replacement ratio with the first generations was higher than the others, I should say, but their standard deviation was lower. So it's a little bit difficult to see the kind of risk return trade-off here. So here I'm just calculating the coefficient of variation, which is the standard deviation divided by the mean. And here it's the standard deviation of the replacement ratio at retirement divided by the mean of the replacement ratio at retirement. So it's not quite the median I showed you before, but it's sort of similar values. And you see again this, the standard deviation sort of risk per unit income or unit replacement ratio at retirement is increasing in the CDC scheme. And this is, again, just due to this intergenerational cross subsidies being rolled forward over time And then each generation is experiencing its own range of possible values. And we sort of have this type of compounding is probably the wrong word, but just increasing range of possible things that can happen in this game. So I am not going to say much more than that because I don't want to overrun because I did last time. But yeah, so I'm just showing the same slide I showed you earlier. Okay, so we see that in this particular CDC scheme, standard deviation of income increases. This is not an unusual result. This happens in certainly other academic papers I've seen on different CDC schemes, but they are CDC schemes, and we see a similar thing. The median income decreases with the generation. Again, this is due to this particular CDC scheme. It's not usually seen in the CDC scheme studied in literature, and it's entirely due to this really actuarial unfairness on an accrued basis in this particular CDC scheme, because it basically has lifetime actuarial fairness on with regards to the benefits accrued by the lifetime contributions, but it doesn't have it on an actual accrued basis, and that's what's given us this sort of odd result. But the CDC scheme, it seems from these results, needs to take investment risk to outperform alternative pension schemes. But then we see this increasing standard deviation, increasing risk building up over time. And yeah, basically there's no free lunch with respect to risk. So that is all I was going to say about that. So there are various papers. Sorry, just this poll has there we go. Various papers that we have submitted. They haven't been published yet because it's all fairly, last few months, it takes some while to go through the review process and so on. But we have some papers here. I can certainly share them if you can't find them on the IFY website. And this is the paper from, it should be David Wilkie and others about their Wilkie model. So I think I will stop sharing there. And
thanks, Catherine.
Thanks very much.
No problem. Maybe we'll start off with the poll and I'll go through the results. Catherine asked you to reflect on that for a couple of minutes. Thanks very much for your presentation. It was really good. So the question we asked you all was, what are the most important challenges to be addressed regarding CDC schemes in your view? So we had 42% that went with intergenerational fairness at the top, Catherine, followed by nearly 20% on product design, 10% wanted to know about smoothing. Actually, employer buy-in was quite high at 22%. And then last but not least was funding. So that's interesting.
Yes, but I mean, definitely intergenerational fairness is, you see from this particular type of CDC scheme, again, it's not the only type of CDC scheme. So you really have to be careful when you say CDC scheme, which one do you mean? But in this one, there's a lot of different intergenerational risk transfers going on. Sometimes they're one way. So they're going from the first generations are benefiting at the expense of later generations. We haven't done it in this webinar, but the previous webinar I did on CDCs a few weeks ago, we also talked about there was risk transfer from the old to the young. And there's just a lot of different things going on, let's say, in these schemes. So yeah, it's definitely an important topic. So, in it.
Yeah, thanks, Catherine. So we've just over 10 minutes for questions, and I see we have quite a few. So if we don't get to your question today, please don't be slighted. We will come back in written form. Let's see. I'll start off with Chintan Gandhi, and Chintan is a partner at Aon, and he said, while I'd love to see an increase in the 8% AE minimum, in the context of the cost of living crisis, he's less optimistic that this will get through for some time. And then the comment is the benefit of CDC as a whole life solution is that the power of pooling leads to an average over 30% better outcomes, which he says, helps gear that 8% contribution to closer to 11%. Do you want to comment on that, Catherine?
Yeah, so I guess in all these things, it depends on basically what model you're using, what CDC plan are you looking at, as to like whenever we come up with numbers, like what's the scheme we're looking at and what model have you done it under? And yeah, it's quite nuanced, and I think from just everything I've read, I think there needs to be some work done to alleviate concerns of people about intergenerational risk sharing with regards to CDC scheme, because that's just a recurring question from people. So I think there needs to be more work from people who are proponents of CDC to alleviate those concerns, for sure.
Yeah, and just following on from that, Catherine, I noticed Chinton also had another comment that kind of points that way. And he asks, have you got plans to do some further research to compare alternate designs with age-related accrual rate CDC design? He's saying that the work that they're doing at Aon on age-related accrual rate CDC designs suggests that these might solve some of the intergenerational comments raised, which is interesting.
Yeah, so within the program, we don't have that within the program as yet, but basically it would be future research. Though at the minute the future research seems lined up to be more in post-retirement options only, rather than a whole life scheme where you've got age-related accrual rate where that would matter. It's definitely scope for someone to be doing it. I mean, there is lots of papers on the literature, not a huge amount, but definitely papers on the literature where effectively they have this age-related accrual rate in CDC pension plans, where they have actuarial fairness. So I would say you could also start looking there as well. You still see this this thing with the standard deviation of the income goes up over time in a similar way, and you just see that the median income or mean income, whichever one you look at, you typically see that that's lower for the first generations and then sort of stabilizes around the time the scheme is mature, and then goes up for the last generations when basically the risk is crystallized, which may or may not work in the favor of the last generations. So those are the sort of standard results from the literature. So we still have this intergenerational risk transfer where you see this particular standard deviation profile occurring.
Thanks, Catherine. Next one from Adrian Boulding. How are you, Adrian? Adrian's the chairman at Spire Platform Solutions, and he asks, is it always the case that first generation gets higher pensions? Surely it depends on the size of pension increases. A scheme that targets large increases like inflation plus a bit could work the other way around and give later generations higher pensions.
Well, I guess so sort of the easy way to stop this is to get rid of this sort of feature of the higher pensions is to do the age-related benefit accrual. But you'll see that the median income, based on previous literature, would suggest that what you'll see is the median income of the first generations will be lower, because basically the effect of actual investment returns is softened again, so they tend to get a lower pension. That's the explanation for the first generation why this comes about. So yes.
Okay, cool. Thanks, Catherine. Danny Quant, how are you, Danny? Danny's an IFOA council member. So would you advocate, Catherine, some kind of fixed term level or increasing annuity for, say, 20 years post age 65, followed by a life annuity from age, say, 85? Danny's comment being that the individual's DC pot split to pay for those two products. And then the insurer's longevity risk is smaller in magnitude and maybe bigger relatively at older age, where there are fewer survivors at age 85 than 65. Do you think this looks like something that might be a fairer share of risk?
So if you don't want to share investment risk, so it has its own, I think we have to work at trying to understand what does investment risk sharing mean. And I think longevity risk sharing is probably simpler to understand. I think it's an easier case to make. So in longevity risk sharing, you are well, it's just got a lot of advantages in terms of you don't have to target a certain age at which you say, I'm not going to live past this age. You can just do things and effectively an expected present value basis. But you still do have systematic longevity risk in when you're sharing longevity risk. Now, whether you buy guarantees or you actually also buy a life annuity to try and mitigate against that, that's a possibility. When should you go into some sort of longevity pooling structure? So if you're young or your chance of dying is small, there's not much benefit to doing so, because basically the expected gain you get from pooling longevity risk is your chance of dying in that year. So if you've got low chance of dying, so say your chance of dying was 1%, then your expected gain from longevity risk sharing would be 1% of your fund value. But from your perspective as the individual, you think, well, if I died, I would lose all my fund because it was shared out among all the others. So that doesn't seem like such a great trade-off for me. So you're probably in terms of if you're able to know all of that, you're probably better waiting till your chance of dying was higher. And then from that point on, then you effectively go into one of these longevity risk sharing structures. And then there's this time at which time, this is another question, when is that optimal to go into such a structure? Mm-hmm. So that's another question. How should you invest? I mean, these are all basically very complicated questions, and like there's many different answers according to everybody's particular setup.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thanks, Catherine. An interesting one from someone who wanted to remain anonymous. How does a pooled annuity fund differ to a CDC decumulation only solution? They seem a bit similar to this individual who asked the question.
Yeah, so a pooled annuity fund can be run as a CDC decumulation only solution. You could also have a CDC decumulation only where you also shared investment risk. So the pooled annuity fund I'm talking about, we're only sharing longevity risk. You could also do investment risk as well. And basically you could say, I'm going to pay you a pension, and every year I'm going to give you a pension increase in retirement. So you join at age 65, let's say, when you retire with your DC pension savings. And then we could calculate a pension increase in the same way as we did for the whole life scheme. You're just doing it for a group of people who are age 65 and older. And then you could share investment risk. Now, so that again is a study to look at as to the build-up of risk, not only from the investment risk side, there's also the build-up of longevity risk in terms of the systematic longevity risk, because systematic longevity risk is like investment risk. If you have more people, that doesn't remove your investment risk, and it's the same with systematic longevity risk. If you have more people, it doesn't remove it. And then we have also, the membership profile. So how many people are in your scheme at different times? That will also have an impact on the risk, and the risk borne by later generations, how big it is. Because if you had a lot of risk building up over time and a lot of people, and then for some reason it shrank down, then you have a small pool of people bearing a lot of risk.
Thanks, Catherine. We've time for a couple more. This is from Andy Scott, who's a senior life insurance actuary at Hymans Robertson. He's just disappeared on me. Oh, there it is. There is a risk that the CDC pension in any year is lower than the previous year or only marginally higher. And this will be a hard thing to explain to members. Is there any warning given to members and employers about this? I guess it's a comms question as well, Catherine.
So what I like about this pension increase approach is that it's not obvious to members that they're effectively making a loss, because in some way they are. The discounted value of their projected accrued pension is going up and down. It's becoming, it could be a negative change compared to previous years. But because the accrued pension is expressed as an accrued pension plus future pension increases, then if your pension increase, say last year was 2% and this year it's 1.5%, you still think I'm getting more money. Even if the actual discounted value of your pension has dropped, you wouldn't be aware of that because you're just looking at the accrued pension. So that's what's quite nice about it, in the sense that I'm not saying you should hide risk from members, but to what extent should they be worrying about fluctuations in asset value? If we're going to be investing over the long term, then should we be worrying about asset values going up and down? Well, that's the job of the fund managers or scheme managers. How much do the members have to worry about that? I'm not saying you shouldn't know, but it's more like, don't want to panic people necessarily when fund values will be going up and down, discounted values will be going up and down. So what is the appropriate way to communicate risk to them about that?
We'll do one more, and to make it interesting, we'll take a bit of a challenge, Catherine. This is from David Pitt Watson. How are you, David? Who's a visiting fellow at the Cambridge Judge Business School and also one of the chairs of the RSA Forum on CDC, of which the IFWA is also in, investigating how some of this might work. But David's comment and question is, Catherine, he thinks that your conclusions, and criticisms indeed, might disappear with the age-related accrual and with annuities properly priced. Is that right in your view? It's back to the point about the age-related accrual.
Yeah, so, well, based on past literature, no. So what will disappear is if you do age-related accrual, you see that the median income for the first generations will be lower. So it'll take a similar path to the standard deviation of income, the median income or mean income. I know they're not the same thing, but either one you look at, you'll see the same path. So it'll be lower for the first generations, then sort of flattening out when the scheme is mature, and then it increases over time. You'll see that profile. So you still have this intergenerational risk sharing. And it's basically that the first generations have a lower risk in the scheme. In the mature stage of the scheme, it's fairly stable. The risk borne by the generations who are in the scheme when it's mature, i.e. we've got people joining the scheme and benefits being paid out. But in the last phase of the scheme, when there are no more people joining and we've just got people basically in retirement and we're crystallizing any losses or gains, the risk in the scheme goes up quite a lot. And that will happen whether or not you have this age-related accrual, or we have here constant rate of benefit accrual. So that's just from the studies I've seen in the literature, which do have, they don't call it age-related benefit accruals. It's actuarially fair, which is meant to be the same thing.
Couple of things for me, just as we're running out of time. That was a great session, and we do have plenty more questions. Just to let you know, they will be going straight to Catherine, and we will answer all of those. Thanks very much, Catherine, for that, and thank you for everyone else for staying online and asking questions. There's a little survey that'll be up on your screen. Please do scan the QR code and let us know some feedback. But yeah, other than that, just thank you so much, everyone, for joining.
Thank you very much. Thanks for all the questions.